Welcome to Graeme Codrington's Future of Work podcast, the podcast that provides insights into how the world is changing and practical resources on what to do about it today. This is episode 10, and it's a very special episode because for the first time I'm recording it in video. I'll be interviewing one of the world's leading experts on culture, and we did that over Zoom and we recorded it on video, so well, we might as well put it up online at YouTube. So if you're only listening and you've only heard me in your ears on the podcast and you'd like to see what I look like, or if you'd like to watch this episode live, head along to YouTube and have a look for Graeme Codrington's Future of Work podcast episode 10. You'll also find a direct link in the show notes. We put show notes up for every episode at graemcodrington.com, and just have a look at the podcast tab and go down to episode 10 for the details. We have been asking you to send through your questions, to send through questions about the future of work. And I've had a few people who've asked me a similar set of questions. It's all got to do with your teams, your hybrid, virtual, remote teams, just having a sense, feeling that your culture is being stretched, that it's fraying at the edges. Now, the language you've used is about keeping your team together, keeping your team engaged, keeping them productive, keeping them motivated, getting your team dynamics working. Only one person used the word culture, but I think that's actually what it is. It's about culture. And when I hear people talking culture, my brain immediately clicks to Steve Simpson. Steve, for more than 2 decades, has been working on understanding corporate culture and developing approaches to helping people to understand and improve their culture. And he's developed, I think, one of the world's leading frameworks in doing precisely that. It's called UGRs, Unwritten Ground Rules. And in this conversation, Steve and I will talk about that. He'll unpack it, he'll explain it to you. Steve has a business colleague, Steph Duplessis, based in South Africa. Steve is based out of Australia, and both of them have become friends over the years. So if I need a disclaimer on this, there's the disclaimer. I don't just view these guys and the work they're doing from afar. Over the years, we've become friends because honestly, I am convinced that they do it best. And I like to be friends and be close to people who do really good stuff well. And so you're going to hear from Steve in this episode. That's all we're doing. In episode 10 of the Future of Work podcast, we are answering your question and getting one of the best people in the world to give us a really great set of answers. I hope you enjoy the interview. So in this episode, I am going to spend the whole episode answering some of your questions because I've had a few people ask me exactly the same type of question. It's a question that I think is about culture. And the question is really, in this disruptive workplace that we're in, remote, virtual, hybrid, whatever language we use to describe it, it just feels as if we're being pulled apart. It feels as if the team is not cohesive. This is language you've used. I think what you're saying is your culture is fraying at the edges. You're not working on your culture. You're not even sure you know what a hybrid culture needs to look like. And whenever the word culture comes up, that's when I turn to the person I think I know best in the world, who knows best about culture. And as I said, Steve is a great mate. He's written books. He's worked for 2 decades on this issue. Steve Simpson, all the way from Australia. It's great to have you joining us in the podcast today. Welcome. How are you? How are things going across in Australia?
Well, yeah, it's pretty good over here, Graeme, and it's great to be with you. Really good to be with you.
Now, Steve, I'm going to give you 1 minute to answer the question, what do we need to know about culture? Now, before you answer that, I need to say I sent a whole lot of questions over to you that I know you're prepared to answer. This one is not prepared because I wanted to put you on the spot. What's the 1 minute version of everything everybody needs to know about culture?
Yeah, thanks for letting people know that, Graeme, because this might be a portent to the inadequacy of what comes next out of my mouth. But 1 minute, I'd say gain clarity as a leadership team about your aspirational culture in the interests of you being successful while making a great place to work. What does your culture need to look and feel like? And aligned to that, then explore, become aware of what your culture is like with regard to your aspirational culture. I think that's absolutely essential for people to tune in to what the existing culture is and the extent to which there is alignment between your aspirational culture and your current culture. Is that 60 seconds, Graeme? Did I do it?
I think you beat the 1 minute mark. And for those people who only wanted a 3 minute podcast, thank you for coming. I hope you enjoyed that. No, thank you, Steve. That's exactly what I was hoping you would do, because for me, I think what's behind some of the questions that have been sent in is this belief that kind of culture just happens. You know, culture happens when a whole lot of people are in a room long enough together, and it sort of just emerges. There's not much you can do about culture, and if there is, it takes a long time because culture is this big thing that nobody really knows much about. My experience of you, and this is why I wanted to put you on the spot, is because I think you are very clear that you can do something about culture. And am I right? I mean, do you believe that culture can be, should be, maybe even worked on, and there is something you can do about it?
Well, whether you like it or not, Graeme, as you know, you've got a culture. So that's either going to happen at an unconscious level, sort of under the table, if you like, and we as leaders cross our fingers and hope that it's going to be good, or we do the alternative, and that is we put this on the table, become conscious about it, and explicitly, consciously work on trying to get the culture that we need to have in place. So essentially we've got a choice, and it's a pretty fundamental choice, Graeme.
So what I'm hearing you saying is that some people have just got lucky. They've got a good culture, but it wasn't because they were intentional, deliberate about it. And maybe is that maybe what's happened as we've been forced to go through lockdown, we've been forced to go into a virtual and remote environment. Now suddenly what used to just work because you were lucky that it worked, maybe that's what you're feeling now, that you're feeling stretched, or that your culture isn't quite what it used to be?
Well, I think there was a bit of a fork in the road when COVID hit, and obviously everyone scrambled to accommodate the new world. And the term, and it's overused, I know, but everyone pivoted to try and accommodate the new context. And it was extraordinary in such a short period of time how much was achieved in that regard. Like, I still marvel at supermarkets, for example, and I know this has happened in South Africa as well as any other country across the planet. The Perspex glass screens were put up in what appeared to be no time in every supermarket in the country. You know, stand here marks on the floor were put on the floor in what appeared to be no time. So it was extraordinary, and that's just a very tiny example of the immense amount that was accomplished when this hit. Now the risk is that occupied and continues to occupy the minds of leaders. That is, what activities do we need to engage in to accommodate the new world? Some leaders I know, I think a minority, but some leaders recognise the importance of their culture as being even more important than ever before, and explicitly focused on their culture. And I think that was the fork in the road that created a massive risk. Do we engage all our time and energy in activities to accommodate and can keep us all busy as leaders, or do we strike a balance and make culture even more important than it has been in the past? Because after all, this is a period where everyone on the planet has felt a mix of emotions of fear, anxiety, stress. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of how much. And by the way, it continues to ebb and flow. which I think makes culture even more important than it's ever been in the past.
I think you're spot on there. You know, I think if we were recording this in June last year, June 2020, we might have been able to give people a little bit more of a pass and say, you're in crisis response mode, you know, and get the stuff done that you have to get done and do what you have to do to get it done. But, you know, we're recording this in June 2021 now. I mean, if you're listening to this and you're still in business, you've clearly survived the crisis already. There might be things that need doing, but if culture is not on your list of things to do, high up on your list as a priority of things to do, well, that's, I think, then part of the problem now. I think you and I would both argue you should have been dealing with culture even back right in the heart of the crisis. But at least now, culture has got to be the next step. So, are there ways of measuring culture? I mean, are there things that people can do to make culture visible to themselves and their teams?
Well, I think, Graeme, to answer that, I've got to talk to my UGRs concept. I mean, this is the right time to introduce it, don't you think?
Yeah, well, I'm glad you think so, because that's why I have you on. I mean, if you're not going to talk about UGRs, what's the point of having you here? You know, just to do a quick intro on your behalf, I mean, this is why I wanted to chat to Steve. What he's been doing for the last 20 years is developing a concept, which I'll let him explain in his own words in a second. But this is the model that I honestly think, and I've done a lot of work, looked at a lot of different ways in which companies engage with culture. Steve, you know, I've said this about you, so I'm not just blowing smoke while we're chatting, but I think UGRs is one of the best things I've ever seen. And so, yeah, with that introduction, dive in, because I think this concept of unwritten ground rules is a way to make culture visible. And Steve, go.
Well, thanks for your kind words there, Graeme. And this is on the back of you asking the question about measurement, because I think if we're talking about measuring our culture, I think the UGRs concept is vitally important, and we can measure culture through UGRs. So UGRs stands for Unwritten Ground Rules, which I define as people's perceptions of this is the way we do things around here. That definition is vitally important. So some examples of UGRs or unwritten ground rules that I've come across in the workplace include things like, at our meetings, it isn't worth complaining because we know nothing will get done. The only time anyone gets spoken to by the boss is when something is wrong, and so on. These drive our behaviour, yet remarkably, they are seldom talked about openly. It's the unwritten ground rules, or UGRs, that constitute a company's culture. Understand UGRs, we understand culture. Culture is simply people's perceptions of this is the way we do things around here. So a person new to a job, they can be senior, junior, doesn't matter, they will normally be quieter when they start their new job than they otherwise would be. Why? Because unconsciously they are tuning in to the UGRs. Why? In order that they can conform. They hold enormous power over each and every one of us. So if I'm a new person, I can be a leader. If I'm a new person and I deduce a UGR which says around here people never disagree with bosses at meetings, then I will quickly pick that up and I will fall into line with that UGR. UGRs are so powerful they can even override people's personalities. They hold extraordinary power, and it's the UGRs that it's a simple, understand UGRs, we understand culture. And by the way, we can measure that, which we can get to in a moment.
So a number of questions jump into my head immediately. I mean, the first thing is UGRs are not written down in the employee handbook, right? I mean, this is not somebody studying the employee handbook to work out how things are done around here. You're talking about something different to that.
Well, people will get an induction or orientation and probably be given the employee handbook. And after that, they then go and find out how we really do things around here. So there can be a degree of alignment or not between what is said in something like an employee handbook and the way things really are. Sometimes UGRs are articulated Sometimes a new person is told on the quiet, oh, that's not the way we really do things around here. Or when the boss isn't here, we don't worry about that. So that's a person articulating a UGR, but they're not always. In fact, I'd say they are less often articulated than deduced. More often than not, we have to work this out for ourselves. In fact, sometimes there's a UGR, Graeme, which says around here, new people have to prove their worth before they're given entry into the inside group. So you have to work things out yourself, prove your worth, and then you're given entry into the inner sanctum in some cases.
And some of the examples you've given are sort of, they feel to me fairly negative. I've kind of deliberately stayed away from the corporate world because that type of environment just doesn't work for me. But UGRs are not only negative, right? I mean, surely there are very positive workplaces to work in.
Yeah, look, I'm glad you've raised this, Graeme, because you're right. If you have a positive, dynamic, productive team right now, by definition, it follows there are positive UGRs. It has to be the case. The key question here is, are our current UGRs a function of luck or chance, or are they by design? Because my view is that in the vast majority of cases, the prevailing UGRs are a function of luck or chance. And I think leaders can do should be doing a whole lot better than that. Indeed, we did research where we asked this question. If the culture of your workplace was to become as good as it realistically could, how much improvement would there be on people's performance/productivity? In our research, Graeme, we gave people a sliding scale that started at 0, because 0 is a legitimate answer. You might think the culture now, realistically, is as good as it's going to get. And then we gave 10%, 20% up to 100% and 100% plus. The average, when we do this with teams, is around 40% improvement would occur. That's 40. So my point to leaders is, if you intuitively know that there is 40% improvement in performance that would be gained by realistically improving the culture, then why wouldn't you be focusing on this by design? Because where else would you get performance improvement of that magnitude? I mean, it's incredible, the performance improvement that can be gained by something that is at our feet. It's the culture of our workplace.
Now, that leads really nicely into kind of why I wanted you specifically in this conversation. I mean, this is something you've been doing for 2 decades. You've seen remarkable results across multiple industries and countries and so on. But in a hybrid environment, and I'm convinced that that's our future. So what lockdown did for us was obviously an extreme situation. But I think what it's done is accelerated in those industries where people can be more flexible, where there is an option for remote and virtual working. I think it's opened the door that will never be shut again, that will be in some form or another. And that's why I like to use the word hybrid, that it's going to be some level of flexibility. Do you think UGRs is valuable in this? Have you already been working with clients who have been attempting to adjust their culture deliberately, consciously, as you're saying, to try and get that performance out of people, but also performance in an environment where people enjoy what they're doing?
Well, it's a really good question, Graeme. In our view, culture has never been more important. Remember, in the context where people are feeling fear, anxiety, stress, it's never been more important than to get the culture right, because things are now much more complex. There were nuanced environments where we used to, again, unconsciously tune into things in a face-to-face context, where we were able to deduce the prevailing UGR. So we'd wait until a meeting had finished and we'd listen to conversations that happened after that. We'd look at stuff like, a person who's under stress from workload or feeling personal grief. We'd notice whether that got noticed or not. So we became attuned to tune into these nuanced contexts where we would pick up the UGRs. Now, in many cases, those contexts have changed, and it's often now through a Zoom or a Teams window that is our only contact with people, and it makes it much more complex, which means I would argue we've got to focus on this even more. And there are different nuances now, like it's simple stuff like to what extent do people have their cameras on in Zoom meetings? to what extent is there interaction in a Zoom meeting? So there's all these different nuances which we've got to learn and adapt to, and I think focus on even more.
So what can leaders or people who manage teams, what can they actually do about this? So I realize you and I could chat for another 3 hours and not run out of things to talk about in terms of unpacking the concepts of culture and UGRs. So one of the answers to my question is they could contact you for more information. But let's assume they're prepared to give us a few more minutes on this podcast. What else could they do now to kind of take this concept of unwritten ground rules and do something positive with their cultures?
Okay, so I think the first step is, as leaders and as a leadership team, we need to get crystal clear and committed to our aspirational culture. Now, we've got a key question that we ask leadership teams, and it's this: what does our culture need to look and feel like for us to truly be successful while making this a great place to work? The companies may have value statements, so the values may actually answer that question. But we need, I think, to revisit it by asking the question, what does our culture need to look and feel like for us to truly be successful while making this a great place to work? It's a really important question. I've got a fear about value statements, Graeme, and it's that I think that more often than not, they are created with genuinely good intent. But my fear is that they are framed around the wrong question, and that is, at a strategic planning session, my fear is that the planning is done and then we ask ourselves the question, so what do we want our values to be? It's sort of completely remote and separate from any strategic planning. Well, I think the whole notion of culture needs to be reframed as foundational upon which everything sits, and I think that's what that question does. So the answers to that question can be called values, it really doesn't matter, but my recommendation is that there is no more than 6 attributes or values, because we don't want too many. That's as many as most of us can remember. So the final set should be no more than 6 attributes. The next thing I'd say, Graeme, is we can measure, and this is where the measurement question comes into play, we can measure the current UTRs in relation to those attributes. So this is based on the back of research done by 2 Australian universities, where we unearthed a way to find out what the current UGRs are. So if we have a value of teamwork, for example, we can get people anonymously to complete the sentence to what we call lead-in sentences. So for teamwork, I wonder how people would complete this sentence. Around here when it comes to dealing with people from other work areas, or around here when you need help. If we have a value of constant improvement, I wonder how people would complete this sentence. Around here when someone comes up with a new idea. So this is a way to measure and find out about the extent to which there is alignment between our aspirational culture on the one hand and our prevailing UGRs. And I can tell you, this is what we do with many, many companies. I can tell you it is a gobsmackingly interesting process to surface the prevailing UGRs in a team and company. It's really fascinating.
I mean, it sounds remarkable, because you're not asking people, does our company exhibit respect or integrity or teamwork? You're asking people, what does it feel like to work here? With key, you call them lead-in sentences or key. For me, it sounds like things that happen. It sounds like you're asking people about not what we say, not what's on the wall in the boardroom, but it's what people's actual lived experiences day by day. And then I'm guessing you've got a mix of positive and negative answers to those questions, which help you analyze what you've got, right?
Well, we're actually capturing people's perceptions of this is the way we do things around here. That's what we're trying to capture.
Right.
And what we do on our online, we call it a UGRs stock take. And for people from the US or North America, You might call this an inventory, but stock take, I think, is a term that's understood in South Africa, I think, and certainly in Australia, where we're capturing the UGRs. And what we get people to complete the sentence in a free-range text box, but we then do something that's really interesting. For each lead in sentence, we get the person to self-categorise their response as having a positive, neutral or negative impact on the organisation overall. So now we've got two forms of data. We've got quantitative in the form of a percentage breakdown of positive, neutrals and negatives. Plus we've got the words, which is, there's so much richness and value in the words that people write. And it's opening a window into the real culture of the company, which is just fascinating.
And then the next step appears obvious, which is that you then improve those. So you then say, well, which of these need to be worked on, and what does that work look like? If there's as simple as that?
Well, pretty much. And if there is a silver bullet when it comes to culture, and there isn't, but if there was a silver bullet, I'd put my money on this. We need shared ownership of the culture. This is not the sole province of leaders. So we recommend, and what we do in most cases is we do this UGR stock take and we share the results with everyone. We get staff involved in reviewing what people have written, get their views on identifying areas of concern, get their views on what it is we can do to make improvements to any areas of concern. We've got to bring this back to the individual. What is it that I personally can do differently to fight for and make a better culture than the one that currently exists? Graeme, what I've discovered over the last more than 20 years, what I've discovered is that there is so many unhappy people in workplaces. What I believe is that the vast majority of those people do not want it to be that way. They've merely given up hope of it being any different. And I think part of the power of UGRs and the process we go through is that it helps people realise that their personal behaviour contributes to the prevailing culture, and it gives people hope that they can do things differently to make a difference, to make a better culture. I think most people want to be part of a positive, productive, dynamic, hard-working team, and this is a circuit breaker that can help that happen, I think.
So look, I mean, ideally it would be great if this was an initiative that the leadership team thought was important, and they went about a culture change or a culture improvement process from the top down and put a lot of money into it to make it happen. That would be great. If somebody listening to our conversation is just a leader of a team somewhere, and they know that it's not within their reach to be able to sort of get you guys engaged and implement a massive program at this stage, it sounds to me as if you nevertheless are opening up something that they could do. Just have the conversation, make culture visible to your team, talk to your team about what you can do next to improve the culture, and just do that, and then repeat and repeat and repeat. Would that be good advice? Would you add advice to somebody who wanted to improve their culture?
Graeme, I think that's really good advice, and I'd just add one thing to what you just shared. I was working with the leadership team a little while back in the UK, and I asked them this question. I said to the leadership team, if I went to your people and you leaders are not in the room, but your people are being candid and open and honest with me, how do you think that they would answer this question? What are your leaders' top 3 priorities? Now this team, I won't mention the company, but it was a very prominent company that many people would know. This team was honest, because the first leader to speak up said this. He said, Steve, we don't even know what our top 3 priorities are, so how would they? So there's a couple of questions that flow from this, and that is, do we want culture to be a top 3 priority? You don't go to jail for it not, but don't spruik culture if it's not a genuine top 3 priority, because I think you can do yourself more damage by doing that. So a serious question across leaders, do we want it to be a top 3 priority? Because if we do, then we've got to think about, well, what questions do we need to start asking ourselves and our people to demonstrate that this is a genuine top 3 priority? Because then it's going to be a standing agenda item at meetings. We're going to dig our talons into this. We're not going to let it go. We're going to fight individually and collectively for a more positive and productive culture. And your people will pick up on this or not.
And Steve, if somebody went about doing that, how quickly would you see the reaction? How quickly would you see a culture improving? Again, some of the questions that were asked that led into this conversation were, I don't have 3 years to wait to get my culture turned around. Again, you've worked with multiple companies across multiple industries. Can this have a quick response?
Graeme, you'd be aware of the conventional wisdom that says it takes 3 years to change a culture. Well, who am I to disagree with this? But I am going to, because I really disagree with that. I think, and I'm talking about companies like, we work with Kmart Australia and New Zealand. It's got 30,000 employees, now Australia's leading retailer. We changed the culture, and by the way, the leadership team was totally dedicated to this. The culture changed within 3 months. But then the trick was sustaining that, because the natural thing for human beings is to revert back to what used to be. But they locked that in and continued to improve it. Through to another company that I'm thinking of now, one here in Victoria in Australia, a paint manufacturing company, where I had them for a full day, including the guys from the manufacturing plant. One of the younger guys at the end of the day came up to me on the quiet and said, "Steve, you've changed my life." Now, that doesn't happen all the time, but he was a young bloke who realised that the UGRs concept had application way beyond the company. Indeed, it has application in families, and he realised that as well. So I'm a true believer that this can be a genuine circuit breaker that can really put a point in time that says things can and will be different beyond this point, and we can create real momentum. But of course, then the task is sustaining that momentum, which is a challenge for leaders.
Steve, thanks. That's just helped, I think, actually answer the question behind the questions that got us into this. And by the way, those of you who sent me those questions, send more questions, because it sends me to find world experts to get answers. That this has been a great conversation. We could go on for hours, but let's conclude now. What you've done is you've helped me to see behind the question that people were asking. I think people who were saying the culture is fraying, I'm struggling with the culture, are actually saying we haven't actually defined the culture we need. We're hoping, we're waiting to go back to the way things were, and hoping maybe that just getting everybody back into the office will lock back into whatever culture we had then. They may or may not have had a defined culture in the office, but they certainly don't have one for the hybrid world. And I think that there are some nuances, some new aspects to culture in this hybrid world that I know you and your team have been looking at over the last few months. So if people want more information, Steve, how can they get hold of you? Where can they go? I know you put out so many resources. There's books to read. There's videos to watch. Where can people find you?
Well, the UGRs website, Graeme, is ugrs.net. And my website is steve-simpson.com. And of course, I'm on LinkedIn.
Yeah, I think if just search Steve Simpson and UGRs on LinkedIn, you'll connect, and you put up great resources on a regular basis. Steve, let me throw the final word back at you. Is there anything else that you would say to people as they are thinking about being deliberate about culture in a hybrid environment?
I guess I'd get people to reflect on that question. If I went to your people and asked your people, and they're being candid and open and honest with me, what are your leaders' top 3 priorities? What would they say, and what would you want them to say? Because if there's a difference, maybe we've got to make a slight adjustment there.
What a great way to end. Steve, thank you again. It's been great chatting to you. Everybody listening to the Future of Work podcast, send your questions in. We can get answers like this to any questions you send. And I'll see you in the next episode as we continue to talk about how you build healthy hybrid teams. Thanks for listening. Thank you as always for listening to Graeme Codrington's Future of Work podcast. I hope you enjoyed that interview. I did. And I hope that if you are enjoying what you are learning on this podcast, that you are sharing it with friends, with colleagues, so that we can get the message out about preparing now for the future of work. Please subscribe on your favorite podcast platform, or if you're watching on YouTube, make sure you subscribe and also hit that little bell notification so that you can be notified whenever we upload a new video. Please rate us on your favorite podcast platform. It really does help to get the word out. And then finally, if you would like to keep up with the future of work, get more resources, go along to graemecodrington.com and make sure that you connect in with me there. Maybe connect in on my social channels, on LinkedIn, Facebook, and so on. Also, go along to the podcast section of graemecodrington.com and ask me a question. That's what sparked this episode, is a great set of questions from a few different people. And the more questions we have, the more we know exactly what your needs are and can provide you with the resources that you need. So please go ahead and ask us any question you like. Just pop into graemecodrington.com and you'll see the links to connect with me, to ask questions, so that we can make sure that we improve the Future of Work podcast for you. I'll see you in the next episode. It's going to be a good one.